I spent years inside the intelligence system learning one unforgiving lesson. Power only works when adversaries believe you understand both their weaknesses and your own limits. What I see now is not the collapse of American military capability, but the collapse of credibility born from intelligence that no longer informs strategy, only justifies it. When a Cuban leader publicly rejects a presidential warning and vows to defend his country to the last drop of blood, that is not bravado. That is a signal. It tells me that U.S. threats are no longer being processed as actionable risk, but as rhetorical noise. In my time as an analyst, we were trained to distinguish between words spoken for domestic consumption and moves that changed force posture, logistics, or alliances. Today, that distinction is blurred. Intelligence assessments increasingly assume that declaratory statements alone can coerce behavior. They cannot. Cuba's response was rooted in a rational assessment that the United States lacks both the political will and the strategic coherence to follow through. That assessment did not emerge from ideology, it came from observing decades of American inconsistency. The intelligence failure here is not missing information, it is a misreading intent. Cuban leadership understands that Washington's pressure campaign is fragmented, contested internally, and subordinated to electoral cycles. Sanctions are announced without enforcement mechanisms that survive policy turnover. Military warnings are issued without credible mobilization signals. From an intelligence standpoint, that is deterrence theater, not deterrence. The strategic consequence is severe. Once adversaries conclude that U.S. warnings are conditional, reversible, and politically constrained, they discount them entirely. That is exactly what happened here. The vow to resist to the last drop of blood was not a declaration of strength. It was a declaration that American pressure has been priced in and found wanting. What troubles me most is how intelligence has been used to reinforce this illusion. Analysts are pressured to frame adversary behavior as reactive to U.S. statements rather than driven by their own structural calculations. That produces comforting narratives, but a disastrous strategy. Cuba is not responding emotionally, it is responding analytically. The hard lesson is simple and brutal. When intelligence stops informing power and starts narrating it, deterrence collapses. Threats become background noise. And once that happens, restoring credibility costs far more than preserving it ever did. I have watched sanctions evolve from a targeted intelligence instrument into a substitute for strategy, and nowhere is that clearer than in how Washington treats Cuba today. Sanctions were originally designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities identified through rigorous intelligence collection, choke points in finance, logistics, energy, or elite cohesion. What they have become instead is a reflex. When policymakers lack leverage, they announce sanctions. When sanctions fail, they announce more. That cycle creates the illusion of action while steadily eroding credibility. From an intelligence perspective, the problem is not whether sanctions hurt. Of course they do. Cuba's economy is in severe distress, facing shortages, energy constraints, and declining external support. That is publicly verifiable. The failure lies in the assumption that economic pain automatically translates into political capitulation. Every serious intelligence study of sanctioned regimes, from Iraq in the 1,990 seconds to Iran and Venezuela, shows the opposite pattern. Elites adapt, populations absorb the shock, and regimes reframe hardship as external aggression. Cuban leadership has been doing this for decades, and they have become highly efficient at it. The distortion occurs when intelligence is shaped to support policy preference rather than challenge it. Analysts are asked to highlight regime weakness without equally emphasizing regime control mechanisms. Sanctions reporting focuses on GDP contraction, inflation, and shortages, while downplaying internal security resilience, elite loyalty, and the regime's proven ability to survive austerity. That creates briefing books that tell policymakers what they want to hear, not what they need to know. The strategic consequence is sanctions theater. Public threats about cutting off oil or money are issued as if they represent escalation, when in reality they signal policy exhaustion. Adversaries understand this. When Cuban leaders publicly dismiss such warnings, they are not ignoring pressure. They are signaling that pressure has lost its marginal effect. Intelligence professionals on the other side see this clearly, even if Washington does not. What makes this dangerous is spillover. Once sanctions are perceived as symbolic, they lose coercive power everywhere else. Iran, Russia, and others study these cases closely. They see that sanctions are announced with great fanfare, but rarely integrated into a coherent strategy that includes diplomacy, force posture, and alliance management. Intelligence that should warn about this erosion instead becomes part of the performance. The hard lesson is one I learned early and see ignored now. Sanctions without strategy are not leverage, they are noise. And when intelligence is used to decorate that noise rather than interrogate it, the system stops producing warnings and starts producing fiction. One of the most damaging habits inside the U.S. intelligence system is the tendency to treat certain countries as frozen in time. Cuba is a prime example. Too many assessments still frame Havana as if it were a Cold War relic waiting to collapse under the weight of its own inefficiency. That mindset is not just lazy, it is operationally dangerous. When intelligence stops updating its assumptions, strategy becomes detached from reality. Cuba is not strong, but it is experienced. Its leadership has survived the loss of the Soviet Union, decades of embargo, episodic unrest, and shifting U.S. administrations. From an intelligence perspective, that survival record matters more than abstract measures of economic weakness. Yet, reporting too often emphasizes crisis indicators while neglecting adaptation patterns. Cuban institutions have learned how to ration scarcity, manage dissent, and externalize blame with remarkable consistency. That is not ideology, it is institutional memory. The intelligence distortion here lies in mirror imaging. U.S. analysts frequently assume that economic pressure produces political outcomes abroad the way it might domestically. That assumption collapses when applied to systems built around endurance rather than growth. Cuban leadership does not govern by promising prosperity, it governs by managing deprivation and controlling risk. Any serious intelligence assessment must start from that premise. Too often, it does not. The strategic consequence of mislabeling Cuba as a fossil is policy complacency. Washington issues threats and expects fear, while Havana hears routine pressure it has survived before. When Cuban leaders publicly vow resistance to the last drop of blood, they are not posturing for internal consumption alone. They are communicating that U.S. policy signals do not register as escalatory. That is a failure of intelligence signaling, not Cuban perception. What troubles me most is how dissenting analysis is handled. Analysts who point out regime durability, security cohesion, and adaptive capacity are often sidelined as pessimistic or unhelpful. The system rewards assessments that align with policy momentum. Over time, this creates an echo chamber where outdated assumptions persist because they are institutionally convenient. The hard lesson is unavoidable. Treating adversaries as static caricatures guarantees strategic surprise. Cuba is not collapsing on Washington's timetable, and pretending otherwise does not make it so. Intelligence exists to update beliefs, not preserve myths. When it fails at that task, policy walks blindfolded into its own irrelevance. Energy has always been treated in Washington as a master lever, something that can be pulled to force compliance across borders. I watched that belief harden into dogma, even as evidence repeatedly contradicted it. The assumption that cutting off Venezuelan oil flows would decisively weaken Cuba rests on a chain of intelligence assumptions that look neat on paper and collapse under scrutiny. The first distortion is linear thinking. Analysts map Venezuelan oil production to Cuban energy supply and assume disruption equals submission. In reality, intelligence reporting has long shown that Cuba plans for a chronic shortage, not abundance. Fuel scarcity is not an emergency there, it is a condition. The system prioritizes regime survival over civilian comfort, and it has redundancies precisely because U.S. pressure is expected. Treating oil as a kill switch ignores decades of adaptive behavior. The second failure is overestimating U.S. control of the environment. Intelligence assessments often frame hemispheric energy flows as if Washington can unilaterally police them. That view is outdated. Venezuela's oil sector has degraded, but it has not disappeared, and alternative channels, gray markets, intermediaries, political barter persist. More importantly, external actors have learned how to operate below the threshold of U.S. enforcement. Intelligence that focuses only on official trade flows misses the operational reality of survival networks. The strategic consequence is misplaced confidence. When U.S. leaders announce that there will be no more oil or money going to Cuba, they are assuming enforcement capacity that does not exist at scale. Cuban leadership hears that and compares it to past experience. The result is dismissal, not deterrence. That is exactly why such statements provoke defiant rhetoric rather than negotiation. What makes this an intelligence failure rather than a policy disagreement is how uncertainty is handled. Instead of clearly communicating limits, intelligence products often emphasize best case outcomes while burying caveats. Policymakers are left believing that leverage is decisive when it is, at best, marginal. That gap between expectation and reality widens with every unfulfilled threat. The hard lesson is one, intelligence officers learn early, but institutions forget easily. Leverage only works when you can sustain it, enforce it, and integrate it into a broader strategy. Energy coercion without those elements is not pressure, it is an assumption. Assumptions are the enemy of intelligence. At some point, intelligence stopped being the tool that challenged power and became the language of power used to justify itself. I watched that transition happen gradually, then suddenly, what replaced rigorous analysis was narrative substitution, the practice of shaping assessments to support an existing storyline rather than interrogate reality. Once that takes hold, intelligence no longer warns, it reassures. The mechanics of this failure are subtle but pervasive. Analysts are no longer asked first, what is happening? They are asked, how does this fit? Products are framed around policy themes, deterrence restored, pressure working, adversary isolated before evidence is weighed, contradictory indicators are acknowledged but minimized. Over time, this trains analysts to anticipate what will be acceptable rather than what will be accurate. The result is not fabrication, it is filtration. Cuba fits neatly into this problem. Reporting emphasizes economic desperation, public frustration, and regime vulnerability because that supports a narrative of impending collapse. What receives less attention is the intelligence that complicates that story. Security force cohesion, information control, elite survival incentives, and the population's long conditioning to hardship. Those factors do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. But in a narrative-driven system, they are treated as background noise. The strategic consequence of narrative substitution is self-deception. Policymakers begin to believe that adversary behavior is being shaped by U.S. messaging when, in fact, adversaries are responding to structural realities. When Cuban leaders publicly reject American warnings, the intelligence failure is not that we failed to predict the rhetoric. It is that we convinced ourselves such rhetoric would not occur. That is the danger of believing your own story. This dynamic corrodes institutional credibility from within. Younger analysts learn quickly which conclusions are rewarded and which are ignored. Over time, dissenting analysis dries up, not because reality has simplified, but because the system no longer tolerates complexity. Intelligence becomes an echo of policy rather than a check on it. The hard lesson is the most uncomfortable one for any intelligence bureaucracy. The moment analysis is judged by how well it supports narrative, it ceases to be intelligence. It becomes fiction with footnotes. And once that happens, adversaries stop fearing your assessments because they know you are no longer listening to reality. One of the clearest indicators that American strategic thinking has drifted from reality is the persistent assumption that the United States still operates in a unipolar environment. Intelligence assessments are often written as if Washington remains the sole axis around which global decisions turn. That assumption quietly underpins threat, credibility, sanctions, enforcement, and diplomatic pressure. It is also demonstrably false. From an intelligence standpoint, the world has been multipolar for years. Power is not evenly distributed, but it is no longer centralized. Regional actors hedge, diversify, and balance in ways that reduce exposure to U.S. pressure. Cuba's posture reflects that reality. When its leadership dismisses American warnings, it is doing so with the confidence that alternative relationships, however imperfect, exist. Those alternatives do not need to replace the United States. They only need to dilute its leverage. The distortion emerges when intelligence products continue to frame U.S. action as decisive by default. Analysts describe sanctions and warnings without fully integrating the countervailing effects of Chinese trade, Russian political backing, or regional non-alignment. The result is an incomplete picture that exaggerates U.S. influence and understates adversary resilience. Policymakers are briefed on pressure, not on adaptation. The strategic consequence is miscalculation. When Washington assumes that cutting off resources will isolate a regime, and that regime instead finds workarounds, credibility erodes further. Adversaries conclude that U.S. power is conditional and negotiable. That perception spreads. It is not just Cuba that takes note, others do as well. Intelligence failures in one theater inform behavior in another. What concerns me most is how multipolar reality is treated as a future problem rather than a present condition. Assessments acknowledge it in theory, but rarely allow it to reshape conclusions. That creates a dangerous lag between reality and policy. Intelligence becomes reactive, explaining failure after the fact instead of warning beforehand. The hard lesson is stark. In a multipolar world, threats require coalition, enforcement, and endurance. Without those elements, they are statements, not a strategy. Intelligence that pretends otherwise is not preparing decision makers, it is insulating them from reality. And reality has a way of asserting itself, whether intelligence acknowledges it or not. The final collapse does not happen when a threat is ignored or a sanction fails. It happens when intelligence no longer shapes power but serves it. I have seen that transformation up close, and once it sets in, recovery is slow and painful. The Cuban response to American warnings is not an isolated episode. It is a symptom of a system that has trained itself to confuse confidence with credibility. When intelligence informs power, it constrains it. It forces leaders to confront limits, trade-offs, and unintended consequences. When intelligence serves power, it does the opposite. It smooths edges, suppresses doubt, and converts uncertainty into assurance. Over time, decision makers come to expect validation rather than warning. That expectation reshapes the entire analytic culture. The strategic consequence is cumulative erosion. Each unfulfilled threat, each sanction that fails to produce change, each warning dismissed by an adversary chips away at deterrence. Eventually, opponents stop reacting at all. They issue defiant statements, not because they are reckless, but because they have learned that American pressure is episodic and politically constrained. That is not a military failure. It is an intelligence failure. What makes this especially dangerous is that the damage is not easily reversible. Credibility cannot be surmised. It is built through consistency, accuracy, and restraint over time. Intelligence plays a central role in that process by ensuring that policy aligns with reality. When that alignment breaks, power becomes performative. It looks strong, but it is hollow. The Cuban leadership's vow to defend itself to the last drop of blood should not be dismissed as propaganda. It should be read as an intelligence assessment of the United States. It reflects a calculation that Washington's threats are not backed by a sustained strategy. That calculation may or may not be correct in any given case, but the fact that it is being made so openly is the warning. The hard lesson, and the one I will end on, is this. Intelligence exists to tell power what it does not want to hear. The moment it stops doing that, narratives replace analysis and fiction replaces warning. When intelligence becomes fiction, strategic collapse is not a possibility, it is an outcome.